So Patrick Hogan and I have been having a dialogue for several years now around this question that relates to what Warren was talking about how it is that people adopt new technologies and how perhaps the advice that startups get and the advice that investors give is not contextually appropriate, that they're giving advice that is not aligned with the current state of the company. And so he and I argue about the question of early adopters versus late early adopters versus early normal, and different choices in those submarkets. And in that conversation, I think that there's something important for us to understand, which is paying attention to the thing that's important first rather than the thing that's urgent first. Everybody says, I need to do something. Well, what is it that you need to do? And hopefully by the end of today, you'll know more about that. So Patrick, can you talk a little bit about your context and then just go right into sharing your screen and doing your talk?
A little bit of context. Grew up in the Pacific Northwest, engineering background, UW. And I was fascinated by innovation, went off to Dartmouth, did my MBA, filled up my bucket with more tools and started using them. And a lot of what we'll talk about today is my continuous research and revision of what tools it takes to help people do breakthrough innovation. And I think Warren will see signs of what I do. Hopefully he finds the insight complementary. And there's other tools that I think Glenn might find interesting, because I've done a co-motion series over in Spokane that gets used heavily. People contact me. And so there's other places that this stuff shows up. So I'll jump into the presentation. Give me a second. Oops. I launched into the wrong place. Here we go. And I think that we have time to dive into any of the content. So if you guys say, hey, this is really interesting, or hey, I'm going to call you on this, because there's a lot of gray hair in the room, which is awesome. And I'm sure they have a perspective and they want to challenge and question some of what I do or what I'm saying. But I love that interaction. So please don't hesitate to jump in. So I gave my review. I care about how people innovate, and that's what I've been spending my career building tools to do that. I think we've done this. We've talked about who's here today, so I'm going to skip that. And the question is, are you fundable? And the pattern that people see, I see in my experience, about half in startups and about half in big corporations, is people say, look at my great idea. Look at this. And they're saying, hey, don't you love this idea? And the problem is they're acting like a development manager, a product manager, where they have the idea and they're thinking about technical performance, maybe some design stuff. And this earlier, one of you mentioned I'm sorry, I forgot the name, that, hey, people are focused on agile and lean, but it's not enough. It's a delusion. Because when you focus on one issue, it's still a big bet. The fact that you're doing lots of things on the same stuff still makes it a big bet. And we all know they fail. And it's not what an investor is looking for. You guys, many of you are investors, so you know that. And it ends up just being a bet that fails big, because there's a ton of other uncertainty that frustrates some of you. There's a lot of other killer risks. And you're not building a company when you're building a product. So there is, I'm going to steal John, there isn't evidence that the team can get some traction. Having an idea is not enough. So the difference, before technology, there's a ton of other killer risks, lots of uncertainty, and who the customers are, does they have a common problem? Do you have a team that works together? Does that product fit? Design, marketing, positioning, package, all these other big risks. And investors want to fund a company they can trust, that can, if not already address them, understand they can address these uncertainties and deal with them. And the more you do, the more likely they are to want to be involved. So today we talked about the situation, and the vision is, how do you develop a healthy company and max micro ROIs? And we're going to talk about what that means. And the two big revelations I had from some hard research was know what your killer risk types are for your project, and then how you manage them. And I'm going to talk about a rule that I learned from serial high risk innovators and where it came from. I'll talk a little bit about it. I think Warren might be interested in it. So then we'll talk, I think hopefully I'll set up a framework, talk about some examples about how people do their homework and how they can target what things they do. Those will make more sense later. And how they can go out and validate their concept with the right people before they build a product or spend money on a product. At the end, I'll kind of summarize the high takeaways. So before I jump in, any kind of big red flags people want to address before I jump in? Nope.
Looks
All right.
good.
All right. So, the vision is you can get funded, that you can show that a team you have can generate a business and get some revenues, and that the market actually cares about that business so you can start to show some growth. Those are the two big metrics for, hey, are things working? And what I'm going to talk about is how people can quickly show that the market cares, a team delivers, and hopefully if you're a founder, that with that evidence that you've developed in a short period of time, you can have a funder saying, take my money. And a key component of that is you're going to show that you maximize your ROI and then their ROI. And there's going to be a trick to that we're going to talk about. So the first step is knowing what to manage. A checklist of tasks, as John referred to, is not contextual. It doesn't actually answer what's urgent, what's important, what do you focus on, what do you not focus on? And it doesn't adapt to uncertainty. So when people are out there trying to raise funds, this is the pattern that I've seen that John knows well. They say, hey, all I need is the dollars to build my product. Give me some money, I can build a great product. But that's not enough because it isn't evidence of those two key components, that your team can get traction. It doesn't show that the market cares about that, and it can't show that the team can actually execute that business. Excuse me. So when people ask this question, and John's asked it, I've asked it, and I'm sure some of you have been in situations where you've asked it for yourself, what is it you should be working on right now to maximize your impact on this product? And the corollary, what should you not be thinking about now? What it would be a distraction? When you ask that question to a room full of people trying to build something new and different, corporate or otherwise, startups, this is what you get. Dead silence. Because there isn't a heuristic to turn the powerful tools they may have, whether it be lean or agile or other tools, to decide what it is they're working on. Nobody really, or at least it isn't common to have a real good heuristic for what is the thing that I shouldn't be working on and what is. And another piece of evidence is CB Insights published this list of 20 things, long list. And if you dig into it a couple layers, you go, wait a minute, what does this really mean? And my assertion is these are all symptoms of core underlying problems that people didn't deal with. They're not the cause of failures. They're the things people dealt with, that thinking that they were the cause, and they're not. And the second revelation, besides many of you know, the first revelation was don't build a product, build a company. The second one here today is manage. There are objects you can manage, and they're the risk types that are the killer risks that kill companies and startups or projects. And customer value, answering the question, would a decision maker buy this? Funding, do you have the money to get resources to do the thing you need to do next? Do you have the skills on the team, the emotional quotient, the esprit de corps? Can people get the value out of this concept that you have? Is it usable? Then do you have the technology or the performance to make it work? And do you have the go-to-market? When I went out and did hardcore research on people who are successful with uncertain, high risk, high stakes projects, they continually used this model to think about how they governed what they did, when they did it, and how they did it. So I'm going to walk through the risk types, and maybe this is something that you guys might have questions about. After discovering this information, a little over 10 years ago, understanding that risk types were the thing that deal with uncertainty in a healthy way and can do it over and over again. I've spent a few years researching, well, what are they and how do they work? And the ones that have worked for me, and they're MECE, like they're a mutually exhaustive set, but they're exclusive, they don't overlap, is the customer economic value. Is it compelling to a market leader, which means there's enough people, buyers, not users, by the way, this is one of the confusion, with a problem. Whoops, sorry, automation is wrong. Which is the right micro market for the least investment? You have a great idea. Which one of these markets is going to find your stuff compelling? And are there enough of them? I'm sorry about this. Is it compelling enough to motivate someone to change what they're doing today? Research says that it's not the price. If you get stuck in price, you're really pushing on the wrong it's a dead button, because switching costs and risks of the unknown are way bigger than whatever price you may doing. So is the value, even at a discount, worth it? Many of you are familiar with this, but it's something that many people don't understand, and they start talking about pricing as the lever to get adoption, when the risk of trying something new and unknown is way bigger in the minds of people who adopt it than a price. So team, shifting to another type. Do they have the skills? Do they have the subject matter expertise? Are they cohesive? Can they work together? Oftentimes teams that are really successful, they say they want subject matter experts in a couple domains, not just market, but also technology, or they pick which SMEs they think they have to be successful. Usability, and it's a basic question. If you have a product, can the people that actually use it get the value out of it that you talked about in A? That somebody said, yes, it's worth it. Good design thinking is part of that, addressing it. And then the funding. Do you have the resources to get to the next step? And performance. Now, notice we're all the way down to E before we start talking about the technology. Is it compatible? Does it work? Is it fast enough? And then finally, the go-to-market stuff: pricing, packaging, partners, marketing, positioning, and selling. I've been refining this list or these sets over the last decade, and they have served me well on several projects where there was a ton of uncertainty, and to get people to mostly not think about the other stuff when they have to think about what's important. Any questions? Okay, so now that we can avoid deer in headlights, or now we say, what could you be working on? At least there's a list of what they are. These are the objects that you can think about and work with. The question is, how do you manage this? And this is what I call innovation Moneyball. It's a new way to think about how you spend your time and how you calculate what's important, so you maximize your ROI. And I came to see it as monetizing uncertainty. It's a way to govern the projects at any point in time that deals with the uncertainty at that point for the project. It uses different decision rules that people know about, don't put them in context on what to focus on and how to focus and when to change focus. So earlier we talked about 6 risk types. So if these are the 6 risk types, what does the concept mean? And it basically is pick one, because all these others, the rest are a bad ROI on your time. Your job is to maximize the return on the mitigation of risk. And you pick the one that's the biggest, because it typically, all the others depend on it, whatever time it's the biggest. And 2, you can use the lightest weight tool to get the most risk mitigation. So you pick the one that matters most, and the one that tends to matter most for new concept is, does this thing have enough value for a buyer to say, I'd pay for that? And you use some of the best lightweight tools to do it. So the mechanics, when I walk into a team and I start saying, what are we working on today? The way I do the planning is, the sprint planning says, I'm going to give this sprint a mission. And you have this check that happens many, many times, which is pick the top risk type that you're going to mitigate for this sprint. Say, I'm going to work on value. I'm going to work on team. I'm going to work on technology. Pick the one you're going to do and stop working on the others. Then pick the best mitigation tool for that risk type, given how big it is. Maybe it's a simple survey. Maybe it's something more complex, but you can, the key that I saw to people who are successful is they did really lightweight models and methodologies to think about these really big risks, to mitigate them some right at the beginning, because it gave them a really huge ROI, both in energy, time, and mostly time, to be frank. That's how they thought. And you go through the normal tools that you know for a lean type thinking, where you hypothesize, validate, refine, and then if you need to, pivot, because you'll learn something. And you keep working on that risk type until it's no longer that risk type. And when it's no longer that risk type, you stop, you satisfy, you don't keep working on that risk type. You're not trying to get it to 0. You're not trying to make it go away. You're not trying to solve it. You just not the top risk anymore. So people who are really good at this just said, hey, why am I sub-optimizing? I've got lots of other things to do. And they literally said, I got bigger fish to fry now. I did this one, and they have bigger issues. So stop on that one and shift to the next one, move to the other risk, in this case here. So top risk now, the model that I've kind of put under this moniker takes 4 key components. The people who are successful at doing risk and how they were different than other people is they knew their MECE risks. In startups, I think it's these 6. Frankly, I don't want to fight about it. If people think that there's 8 or 4, or they do it, think of it, I don't care. The value is picking one and not working on the others until you switch. I feel confident in these, but it's not important to fight about whether there's 8 or 4 or how you bundle them. Then they had a best of breed toolbox where they knew in a risk type, they could mitigate that risk quickly with a tool. And think about each of these drawers was for a particular risk type, and they'd have several tools in there, 3 or 4 tools, and they grab the one that would get them a lot of return for the situation at the time. Again, adapting to the situation. Apologize for the neighbors, lawn work. Then you use the learning model that you know. So if you're good at ceremonies for learning model, great. You use these now with a mission, and then you satisfy. Once you hit the point where another risk is now the top risk, you may have taken 3 or 4 whacks at that nail, but then you switch. And that's because, guess what? That has a better opportunity for you to actually govern your resources and time. So it's also very akin to theory of constraints. And one of the things that I heard many times from the people who did this is they hate the concept of efficiency. They disdain it, but they really care about being effective. They are effective at mitigating a risk in a short period of time. and then they move on. So for startups, what does this look like? So an example pattern is, first you start out and say, hey, I got to understand if there's a market segment that thinks this is valuable or not valuable. And you find some people who think it is. Then you go, well, what is their problem space? What is the thing that they're compelled to do something about? And you can dig into that issue. And then you might do another cycle on, are there others that might value the concept more or have a slightly different problem? And so you haven't built anything. You're just in the customer development phase, but you're actually doing problem market fit. And you do cycles until you say, you know what, I've settled on a group that actually works, that I think I can engage and should engage. And then you start doing things like, is my team know enough about these people, this place, their problems? And do you have to change your team if that's the big risk, because you answer no to many of those things? If you answer yes, and you do some cycles and you learn about that group and what really their top goals and challenges are, and understand how you fit your idea fits in that space, then you can move on to how should they use it? Develop a design that works. And then maybe it's time for finance, maybe not. You can start working on performance and technology without financing, great. Start doing some prototyping and thinking about the technology that will solve a problem your team can work on and end users can get value out of. And then you can start thinking about go-to-market. But that would be a sequence. Now, this is one of the things I'm trying to emphasize is this may be a list. There is no perfect list. This is an example of a team that might be using it. And I'll talk about another one later. And the beauty of it is you ramp up the investment in time and energy as you decrease your risks. So you start getting high ROI and you basically pick the low-hanging fruit with lower investments and then start increasing as you go. So now I'm gonna, well, any questions before I move on? I was going to explain where this came from, where the research came from, where I discovered this. And before I do that, are there any questions? Nope, I see head shaking, no. So building on some of the stuff Warren had done, I understood crossing the chasm, and I needed to engage as a product manager to build features for the mainstream market leaders, not the early adopters, not the mainstream. And I needed to walk into a room as a product manager, look at the 10 people and tell 9 of them to go away because I had talked to them enough times and enough projects. And so I built on some knowledge of psychographics, some research that had been done at Harvard and some of it has been done here at the UW on how you can tell how people are thinking. In that process, I found successful governance model because the key indicator was actually how they dealt with uncertainty and how it contrasted with everybody else. So I needed to walk in and do what are the indicators, the questions I ask and the answers I hear for adopterness. So I did hundreds of interviews. I got, teams of decision makers in the room and said, how did you make these decisions? And then I put that into a really complex model where I had over 1,350 participants making decisions around complex models about their top project. So I had about almost 4,000 projects worth of hardcore decision data, which had over 400,000 decision points. And I started using Shapley value game theory. And what I had learned from these psychographic research that had done it, again, at Harvard and the UW, and say, how can I find a question to ask somebody and to get an answer? And, one of the things I could do was quickly understand who are the crazies on the front that are going to tell you everything is wonderful. Again, part of the principle of the pre-chasm people is they love it all that's new. They love new stuff. Oh, and by the way, what risk? When you ask them about risks, what are the things that could treat you? They go, huh? What? They had no concept. They didn't understand what uncertainties were really going to face them. They just saw that because there was uncertainties, they wanted to go there. Then there was the mainstream. Again, where you want to get with a startup, where the gravy is, and where most larger organizations are busy mining the great gravy of an established, stable market, where people crossing the chasm want to get to. And their characteristic is they don't take risk. Their risk mitigation model is, did it get used enough time by other people so it's proven not to be a problem? By the way, the danger, again, and why I set out on this research was there were lots of them, especially when I worked for larger organizations and we said, go talk to your customers, who will talk your ear off. And I could actually build exactly what they asked for, but they'll never buy an early version of anything. That's just not how they think. They wait. I literally had this conversation. I have now built you exactly what you expect. Will you sign a deal? No, I won't sign a deal until 10 or 20 other people use it. I said, why? It's like, I don't know. I just don't. So I built them exactly the spec. So in between, in the chasm, as Warren may call it, what I found in the psychographic model was these people successfully adopted new breakthrough concepts that weren't the norm to help them beat their competition, to gain a competitive advantage. They had a common goal and a common thinking about why they took the risk and how they were going to deal with the risk. And remember that toolbox I spoke of. Literally, when I would start talking about those tools, and I knew I was talking to somebody now that was in this group, their eyes would light up because they knew that they could use those tools to deal with uncertainty and risk that no one else would dream of taking on because they'd built that tool set. They almost always succeeded to a person. When I said, oh, what's your failure rate? They kind of went, what? What do you mean failure rate? Like, how often do your projects not work? They go, well, we have to talk about not working. We always make positive investments. The key was they'd had this really healthy relationship with uncertainty. We all talk about the enemies, right? It's the keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. These people saw that and they got to know it really, really well. And so what I did with this data is I figured out how I could go engage them to get feedback and sell to them and then emulate how they were successful. And that's what most of what we're talking about. So how do they win? So this is what I saw in both the data and in the conversations is in a domain. It didn't matter what domain, by the way. It didn't matter if I was talking about artists doing new things in AR, VR, or IT managers or marketers. The pattern was common. They were expert on their risk types. When I asked them, hey, tell me about your risk, they'd give you a list. They'd start swinging their hands in the air, actually, like it was Minority Report. If you've seen the Tom Cruise movie, and say, got this risk, and they just tell you the things that they wanted. And then you'd say, well, tell me about what you do about them. And they could tell you about, oh, this risk over here, I have 3 tools I go to. I have this risk over here. I got 2 tools over here. They would talk about their special sauce of tools for each risk type. And they never had one. They always had multiple because in different situations, the best return would use a different kind of tool depending upon the risk level and sequence. So when they took on a project, they'd say, this one has not all 8 that I know exist in my world, but it has 3. And they would take on that, would have then they would know what they were, and they knew the relevant killer risk for that project. And then they always knew the profile. So for that project, which one's most likely going to kill you? They would tell you what number 1 is, and they would tell you what number 2 is. And then they would quickly go, I don't know about the others. They knew the top ones. And so they would create the lean cycle, agile cycles, whatever learning model of the day. And they would focus on that one risk type that was most likely going to kill them. And they would try to find the best, lightest weight tool to mitigate that risk, the most amount of that risk quickly. by getting a best of breed tool. So they'd use that tool specific, and they might change the tool. Like if you were, maybe you're doing nails, maybe you start with a framing hammer and then shift to a finishing hammer as you work your way on that nail, because they change the job, but they change it constantly every time they reassessed. And then they knew when that risk was no longer the thing that they needed to think about. Good enough. These are words. It was effective words they would use. Good enough. They didn't polish things. They say, okay, I got to stop. And there was this remorseless attitude towards the mess they left behind. Me as the ex-engineer looked at the chaos that they said, oh, I'm done now. And they'd move and I go, whoa. And that's fine. I got to work on something else. And the words they used, here's a quote. You're right. It's messy. And it is a little risky. It's messy, but I would never know if the investment I made in improving that situation now will ever pay off. The world is too messy. If I have to come back and it is an issue and it continues to be important, I will address it. But I need to move on. I got bigger fish to fry. So in all this data across these 4,000 projects, again, they claim 95% success rate. I'm being generous and leaving it at 90 because no one ever really believes it. They always succeeded. One of the indicators was, of the people that I talked, didn't matter about industry, role, business, niche, vertical, it didn't matter. They had twice the budget of everybody else. Their organization said, you get results, here's more money. They didn't ever make big bets. They never had big fails. They mitigated these killer risks cheap before they made bigger bets when it was early in the evolution of the project. They found the cheapest way to take a small bite of the apple on a risk and mitigate it. Now, this is in contrast to the world I was in and often see, where teams do what they know. They know that market or they know that technology, and they just keep, for instance, crafting code. They work on Agile, they do MVPs, they're trying to fail fast, they're doing their tool really, really well. They might use design thinking, that's becoming more popular. But when they throw it out there, all the risk types are getting signaled back to them in their feedback, and they don't know what to do with the information because they're testing one thing and they don't know what to do because they haven't appropriately tested. Is it the right market? Is it the right people? Is it the right problem? Is it compelling enough? Is it usable? Is it pricing? And of course, the death is it's a little bit of all, right? That's what creates zombies because they never get consistent feedback. They're not testing a hypothesis for one of those things. They're testing all of them at the same time. They don't know it. So when you're asking about sequencing, back to the deer in headlights, what should you work on now? They go, oh, hey, everything is a nail. I know Agile, I know MVP, and they do what they know. And if they're getting negative feedback, they just ramp that one up faster. Go, 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 go. Pound, 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 because they don't even know the other objects. And they don't know when to stop and switch to something else. They do what they know. Polish and craft, and they release more often, which is an unwitting Agile death march. They're just making one big bet still on technology. Any questions?
Yeah, one question.
Yep.
So you talk about the tools. Do you have you done any research into what the tools look like? And is there some commonality between them for the various types of risks?
Yeah, and we'll give a high level about that. And if if the team wants to keep going, a lot of the times, by the way, the tools change per domain. So what I've now described to you is a somewhat general version. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how this plays out in a startup. So we're going to walk through that debate at a tactical level, saying, hey, I have value risk. What do I do to do that? And we'll talk about some of those scenarios. Like I said, if I've also done this long enough that I've seen a question pop up multiple times and had to develop new models to help a team that's deep into this risk do something new. So I'll give it a little allusion to that, and we can dig into it if people want to spend the time. In fact, Larry may remember some of it. We talked about how value is not a one-dimensional product, not one-dimensional, and it's multi-dimensional, and how I help a team pull their product apart and embellish what's really compelling and cut back on everything else, and how they develop a language to do that. Larry's at a workshop for that. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I kind of jump into, hey, here's some stories. Here's some, I'm going to show a framework and talk about different stories. And when, I think of them as when I was a potato experiences of, okay, I was down in the dirt working it out. So I'm going to start on the journey of how I've helped teams, and John has helped teams maybe without this model. We'll go back and forth on it. Work through this process and how the rule helps you adapt to the situation of a project. And by the way, I have like 47 tools that I've developed that are these pinpoint situations where teams get blocked trying to solve these things. This ends up being the one that I leave behind, that the teams have the most. This top risk now model is the one that people get the most value out of because they put their resources to the right way. So, so in a scenario where you want to first discover if there's a common group that actually has a problem, you want to make sure that there's a group that solves the same problem. And I do that at certain stages with certain tools. And John has developed some advice that's working in his groups that have to do with marketing to the different potential roles and players. I would say roles, I mean decision makers, and look at what it takes to create a community that pays to have an engagement. So they indicate their willingness to pay and be a payer because they have a problem, they want to make it solved, and they'll do something. So that's one of the methods that John uses. And by the way, John, if you want to jump in, and this is where the psychographic, go ahead.
The key piece at this point is that founders will say, well, I haven't talked about my stuff yet because the product's not done. And our goal at the very beginning, if we believe in the 4-step epiphany, and the first step is customer problem fit, then what we're trying to do is qualify that people are customers. And so somehow you have to prove that people are willing today to spend money on new things to solve their current existing problem, and then gather and group them so that they are they're solving the same problem. And that can happen without selling your product or even talking about your solution.
You're just validating they'll spend money to make something that hurts be less hurtful, hurt less. And so how do you engage them? How do you find them? These are some of the tools that John knows well, and many of you probably do know too. Early adopters, they have a problem. They know they have a problem. They're spending money on the problem, and they're happy to spend more money on it. And the trick of creating this kind of pseudo community is they're willing to spend more money, and that's how you know that they're willing to do it. In other projects, I have, in order to understand potential value prop, I'm happy to engage anybody anywhere on the front of the curve because they'll try something, but I make sure I drive decisions about investing in the product, or the effort, I should say, in definition of value, by making sure I engage these people I call gateway adopters, the people that live and die in the chasm. So in Top Risk Now, if you've done a bunch of work, and I think you've used some of the tools, and you get to the end of one effort, one survey, one group meeting, is this no longer the top risk type? So you have to ask yourself, hey, do I need to switch now, or do I do more? And John, you have your metrics for potentially deciding, hey, do I have 100 names? Have they spent money with me? Are they in a Zoom group that they're paying for? You know, if that's enough and I have the names, maybe that's enough. I have done my work now for almost 15 years and gone to like 20 something markets, different markets in different places. And I feel pretty comfortable that if I use my psychographic model for finding gateway adopters, I know after about 5 of them that I'm comfortable telling my team that we need to start shifting to something else. We need to start talking about other risks, because I know what that group says is important, what their goals are, and what challenges they need to go away. So if you have that new top risk, what is it? And it can be the team risk. Again, I alluded to this earlier. Do they know the scenario? Do they know how to work together? Can they keep someone happy, anyone happy? And notice that I circled the front of the curve. Can they just work together to do something that makes somebody happy? Can they know how to get feedback? Can they build what someone wants? Can they at least understand that they should build something someone wants, even if they don't? 85% of this is noise. So you're not actually looking to invest heavily in what people say in the front of the curve. You're just trying to make sure your team has a machine to think about it. Or is it value? Are you at the stage where you need to grow? And this is where the gateway adopter insights are valuable. It's like, what do they think is compelling? What do they think is not necessary? What is a point thing that will say, I will stop what I'm doing and I will switch because this is going to help me in my quest to gain a competitive advantage. So depending on where you are, again, same rule. Stop, think, look, what's your next risk? Not a rote list. Assess it for yourself. What's the top thing? And so each of them involves the great learning loop, right? Do your check, create a hypothesis to test for value or the right customer, for features, for positioning, and test it. And then synthesize what you learned, pivot or refine, and move on. So it gives Lean a mission that's focused on a risk type. So this is a little bit of this is a framework where there's a timeline. You start a project, you're thinking about working on it. And if you say, okay, great, my first risk is value. It's the biggest one. I don't know if there's enough people out there that have a problem to solve. And so you do your work and you think, well, I'm going to do some cycles on value. Is there people out there? But the next one I need to think about is team. Is my team really the right team for this project? Or do I need new people because I'm going to expand it? You do your check and you go, oh, you know what? Value is still my problem. I may have a group that are paying, but I don't know what their real value prop is, what they really is their top problem. So you might do some more work and you think, you know what? Since I got that right, maybe usability is my second one that I keep looking at and saying, how's my usability risk? My team seems to know what they're doing. I do some more refinement and then I find out, whoa, you know what? Team still is my problem. When I dug deeper, I need to know more about the problem space, the users, the different users. You need to actually have a team that can go in and do some work. And it may be about usability. It may be about, do we know enough about the domain to build the flow that matters? So you work on the usability after you get the team. And maybe you think, well, I'm going to work on usability. And maybe once I do that, I need to build the team again. Well, yeah, you might have to visit it again. You might have to augment your team. And so this continues where you look at the risks, performance, is that what matters? Now you're going to work on the technology and you're going to work on that for a while. And you go, well, you know what? Now that I have a scenario and I have a team and I'm checking out and I'm making a product, go back again and say, let's make sure that this thing is compelling enough and it has the capabilities, it's compatible. For instance, okay, now I know it works. Can it work in the environment that the customer has it? And you might go check that. And then you can move on to go to market. So that might be a typical sequence. Anytime you may pivot, you may say, hey, I've helped teams that started with the belief that a certain BDM was the right person, develop a product, find out that there was another person. It was a game company, by the way, and they were really focused on end users for adoption. And we got involved and looked at that end user experience and said, but they're not the hosters of the game. The people that make the economic decision are actually where the game is played, which was their target at the time was bloggers. They wanted a blog site to adopt the game and have it on their site. So we reshifted, went back and started the process again with the economic decision maker, essentially the channel for that team, and then walked through this. And by the way, when we walked through this in 2 weeks, we cut their time to market for their first adoption from 9 months to 6 weeks. So I took 2 weeks with them to reshift, reprioritize what risks they worked on, and they got a product 6 weeks later instead of 9 months later for the people who made the economic decision because they refactored what they thought was important. And it really had to do with the concept of, this is where, when I really got into the conversation with these gateway adopters and how they thought about how they manage, and they said things like, got bigger fish to fry. They thought about the total risk across all of their potential risk types, and then they beat on the thing that was going to give us the best return early on and mitigated the risk cheaply. And we know that if you're a potential startup and you still have a lot of these risks, when you talk about them, there are very few investors that will take that leap and say, yeah, here's a check, because there's so many things you haven't figured out. They may not know exactly what they are, but they know they're there. They, at some level, they know they're there. And if there are investors that will do it, they expect a lot. They expect a big chunk of your company. And at the other end, if you can mitigate the risk, at any point, you might find an investor who will take that risk profile. But as you work your way through to the product and go to market, and you've mitigated some of these big risks that are most likely going to kill a project long before technology does, there'll be multiple people who say, yes, that's you taking care of the big killers, and I would like to fund you. So earlier, Shawal, you asked about what are the tools, and things that I've seen happen are things like, and I'm just going to walk through a bunch of the things that I've developed when I've said, okay, if we're doing this, we have key questions to make. So John does a great job, if you've heard him talk about, hey, if you're going into the education market, there are, I think, what did you say, 10 or 11 decision makers, John?
Yeah, usually it's, the dozen.
Yeah, there's students, there's parents, there's grandparents, there's teachers, there's principals, there's districts, there's federal. So any market that I've done this on, I have found that there is a small sub-market for which the team thinks they need to build this much. They've been able to find this much, 10, 20% that a subgroup will find compelling quickly when they define what compelling is. And so they have multiple markets you go after. And so I lead them through a tournament model and say, hey, you got 5 markets you could go after. Which one can you be compelling and generate revenue the quickest? Usually takes a couple of days. Walk through it, boom, they make a decision, and they're all behind that. It's a transparent way to decide of the markets they could go after, which one they're going to do first, and which ones they could grow into. So that's a common problem at that early stage of which market. And then once they decide a market, again, this is where Warren gets in. Demographics are not enough. You really need to psychographics. That's where I've spent a ton of energy and years of time saying, if somebody answers a question a certain way, where do they lie along this adoption curve? And knowing that you're doing something that's new and different, how to make sure you don't listen to the mainstream because they're just going to lead you astray. And depending upon what you're doing, are you building your team? Are you just making some revenue early? You're getting some, trying to get a healthy group together, or are you trying to get to the growth stage where you say, no, I'm building features that the mainstream will like? You can ask, I have 4 simple questions. I have one, just like an analyst ask you when you go in for a psychological review, one key question and with 3 follow-ups. And I can tell actually with 85% confidence after 2 questions, if you are or not a gateway adopter. And then if you find them, understanding what compelling means, and this bumps into some of the stuff that Larry's seen me do workshops on, where I talk about, first, there are lots of problems. Everybody has problems. And if you ask them if they had that problem, they'd say, yes, I have that problem. But they're not going to change because that's not important enough to them. And so how do you ask questions of the right people the right way so you find out what the important stuff is that they're pounding on? Now, John and others do a great job of saying, well, if they're writing checks, that's what matters. I have some other things that I try to do, lightweight tests, where I try to make sure I understand in an interview quickly what my hypothesis is, and I get feedback from these gateway adopters to understand what they're spending money on, why they're spending money on, and come up with the metrics and benchmarks for success with 3 simple questions about what their goals are, what their solutions are, and what gets in the way of them succeeding. And I end up with in an hour and a half interview of a few people, I have an operational definition for what they want you to do for them. And again, back to the stuff Larry's talked about, is viable is not enough. So I've done this work and people start working on technically viable stuff. And that's not how humans think. Humans are not looking for the technology, they're looking for a solution. And when teams, again, about 15 years of getting in with teams and having them argue about how valuable something is, or the gap between what value is for one or the other. And that's not how human beings think. They have a 2-dimensional model for how they think about what's valuable and not. And I've operationalized that concept so that a team could understand what their potential delighters are and what are the things they just need a mid-bar, and quickly come up with a shorthand so a team can say, oh, I have a new mission for 80% of my product, which is just make it work. And they all agree and understand it. And then what is the delighter they're going to gold plate? And so these are tools where I've run into very specific issue, addressing a very specific risk type, where the tools that we have may or may not be good enough. But since I've asked the question specific enough, I've come up with models that have helped teams really unleash and unlock their creativity and do really cool stuff. And like I said, I have never had a team shorten their time to market less than 75% to get something to someone, because they think in these terms about what's compelling for who, specific market, and they focus their alignment to that value. Any questions on that? Whoops, sorry. No?
Shaiwal, are any of those tools meaningful tools that you would like to step into greater detail at some point?
I think all of those are wonderful to talk about some more.
I have slides in the appendix, so I'm happy to talk about more if people want to spend. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'm happy to to chat about any of them. By the way, so I'll give a little pitch about what the outcome is. This Hourglass interview is something that I developed over time because I looked at my research and I said, I'm just getting noise. When I try to talk to somebody about their problems, 85% of the feedback was noise. It was either assumed solutions, so that just said, I don't know what the pathology is. Just use this, like, wasn't helpful. The other was outcomes, which was super valuable, but not what I asked. I want it to be like this. I don't want it to be here. I want it to be somewhere else. And the other was symptoms. They just said, it hurts, it hurts. And those are not bad pieces of information, but they're not what I needed to help drive a product. And so that's why you see this, like I've been using it for almost 15 years now. There's a reason people take years and years of STEM education to understand the difference between those things I just said and the root cause of a problem. And each domain needs it. And you know what? It's not customers' job. It's not their job to know the pathology that's bothering them. They're not supposed to design a product for me. So I spent about 3 or 4 years asking different words and looking if I got useful feedback. And so what are your top 3 goals? What are the 3 things that are getting away each of those goals? And what are you doing now? And then I shut the heck up because they can answer those questions. They know how to answer those questions. And what they tell me is actionable. So there's one hint. So the outcome is I know what matters and I have an operational definition for success. And I know that it matters. It's one of these. The other one is one that Larry has seen, and maybe, I don't know if he wants to pipe in because he's seen it 2 or 3 years ago. I can spend time talking about the fact that I help teams develop a language or use a language that says, oh, wait, there's some of this stuff that's going to get me a competitive advantage, and my team needs to gold plate those 2, 3, or 4 features and deprecate the rest. They have to be there. We got to have them. It's a broken product if we don't, but they don't have to be embellished. We're going to embellish the delighter that's going to gain us a competitive advantage. I can spend time on that.
So Patrick.
Yep.
Yeah, Larry here. Hey, in regard to that, I took what you taught me about delighters, and we did incorporate Delighter into our marketplace. And it is the absolute #1 thing that people focus on, and they go, oh, wait, what? You do what? They go, wow, that is awesome. So yeah, thank you.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, we trimmed away a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And I said, no, can't have that now, can't have that now, can't have that now. And, you know, in a marketplace, there's a lot of stuff.
Yep.
But that delighter, I said, no, we got to build that. We got to put that in there. That is going to sing their song. And it does. So,
and you strip back everything else that had to be there to support it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Again, this is years of doing it now. It's amazing how capabilities that people think have to be embellished, but everybody has them, can be stripped back to the bare bones if you're going to deliver a delighter. If you say, here's the delighter, maybe you guys don't know the auto business, but BMW made its original mark on the world by being the driving machine. And they had terrible interior, but they had awesome engines, and ride and handling, especially handling, was fantastic. And they could deliver a wildly inferior, plasticky, cheap interior. But the people who loved it and paid a premium for it. It cost the same to build the interior on a 5 Series as it did to make the interior on a Chevette. Not a Chevette, one level up. It was the General Motors mid-level car at the time. The actual marginal cost was the same, but because BMW found a delighter, people were willing to put up with mediocre interior capabilities. And that's what I have found with this language. I could spend time on that if you guys want to. I'm trying to give you a high level. The gateway adopter thing is another thing where I could spend some more time on saying, how do I walk into a room and know who is living in the chasm? And Warren may be interested in that. He may want to challenge me on that. I would love to have that expertise, check my findings and how it maps to his thinking. Then he might find it interesting. So I'd be happy to chat about it. John, how do you want to decide to move forward? I was going to hit the summary, and then we could jump into any areas that you think it's appropriate for this group.
Yeah, I think it's useful for us to talk a little bit about our dialogue between early adopters and late early adopters.
Yeah.
In terms of why we're focusing on those 2 ends of that thing at some point. But why don't you summarize it up, and then let's open it up for questions and see where people want to go.
Great. So this is I hope you take this away, even if only a small couple of pieces. I hope that, like I helped Larry, there are ways to think about your challenges that will have a really positive outcome. And of all the things I've told people, this is the one that actually has the biggest outcome is, for those who are trying to get funded, or I would flip this around for those who want to fund something. And I thought this would actually be more interesting for people who are funding, or more useful because they can govern with it. The fastest path to revenue is you're building a company, rescope your thinking beyond product, stop doing what's new and comfortable. And yes, you're going to have to go learn some things and you're going to have to do some new thinking, but it uses the model for the learning model. Use what you know, but change the content. Top Risk Now is the manual for lean and the learning model. It gives it a focus. It gives it a purpose. It isn't just go faster. It's go faster to achieve an outcome. So don't be the deer, know the object, know the 6 types of risks and be able to say, which one of these? So you can at least answer the question, even if it's wrong. If you get the wrong one but you stop working on the other 5, until you check on a couple of iterations, you go, wait a minute, this is the wrong one. I need to switch to another one. You've made a huge stride because of your ability to focus and execute on what is likely at least a big one, if not the top one. And the decision rule to monetize risk, to think through and say, every time I check, my job is to maximize the return on reducing uncertainty, the total uncertainty in the project. So you stop focusing on low return stuff. You give lean a mission. You assess what the risk is. You know what not to work on. You take small slices. Again, there end up being very small slices that in the end never have big failure. Use the best tool. That's probably the biggest challenge, is this toolbox I've showed you are what I consider the best, because other people have tried to, or have done, they're successful at doing this model and they use the tools they have. They're still wildly more successful. I've just been doing it for more than a decade and I've kept running into these same decisions over and over and over again and said, okay, I need to go find another tool. This is not good enough. And note, the gateway adopter concept, the people that live in that chasm, that small 5-10% of any group, any psychographic, we're helping you emulate how they have serial success, how they govern and almost never fail, and why they have twice as much money, because they never fail and their reward system around them says, here's more, go to it. In fact, at one market that I looked at, of the total population that I surveyed, of the thousands that I went to, I asked them about what is discretionary spend and what is already undiscretionary, things that you've got to spend money on. And of the total market, the gateway adopters had half of the total discretionary spend that wasn't assigned to a project. So if you went and found them, this is why if you want to grow and you find them, they have the freedom, if you have the right value prop, to write a check for you and their value buyers. So you want in the growth stage to find them. And this is a segue into something John and I will talk about here in a few minutes, where we get into it sounds like we're arguing, but we're not. We're debating how to tell the difference between different parts of the front of the curve and why you want to know them. So, getting funded, show evidence and build trust with potential investors that you can demonstrate that you know how to mitigate risk. They love that. People love that you're doing it and you do it on the cheap so that your team can actually get their first revenue and then engage the right people and show that the market cares about that idea and that business. So any questions before we jump into one of the subtopics? And John has picked the gateway adopter, or should I say psychographic model, and I can jump into that. But before we go there, any other questions?
John Dex has a question.
Yes.
Hi, Patrick. And I'm sorry I joined late because I really enjoyed what I was able to hear. First of all, shout out to a fellow Tucky. I'm surprised we both live in Seattle and haven't met one another yet.
Well, hopefully we can.
I'm glad we have now. A lot of what I heard you talk about reflected things that I've overlapped, I would say, but maybe augmented and added to what I've heard from people who talk about customer development process, like
Yep.
Cindy Alvarez from formerly of Microsoft, who's written a book about it, and Ash
Right.
Maurya, who talks about, whose books are Running Lean and Scaling Lean. But he talks about iterating on the most important thing, and you've refined that, I think, to very specifically talk about risk. But I'm kind of curious about those contrasts, and if I'm getting that right, and how you kind of see your
Insights.
your philosophies kind of connecting with those, or whether they've got it wrong and you think you've got a better approach.
I don't think any of what they've talked about is wrong. So let's start there. And like Warren, I don't think anything Warren did and his team or Jeffrey Moore did was wrong. I just felt like I needed more specificity about what the heck I did when I needed to make a decision. So lots of people have process about how they did things, but I needed to make key decisions about who, what, why, when. And I didn't have the answers to that were really being productive. So who do I go after? Why do I go after them? When do I stop what I'm doing? And so I think that I add decision rules on top of really good process. Another way I'll share, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. My grandfather was a world-class marksman, so we grew up around lots of firearms. And I think of lean, for instance, as somebody handing a 12-gauge shotgun to me when I was 12 years old. That was so powerful. And I could shoot at a tree and shoot at a log and shoot at a model I built when I was 8. And wow, what was that? And my dad kind of let me safely carry away and said, okay, now we're going to give you some guidance on how to use that. And I learned how to be really good at skeet shooting because we said, okay, we're going to use this kind of shot in this kind of situation. And he would take me to the woods and throw a skeet through the trees, and I'd have to pick it out when it was going to come onto a gap. And so I feel like everybody's taken lean, and even to a lesser extent, tools like customer development, and said, here you go. And they've handed it to you. And they haven't actually given you the guidance about what to use, when to use it, when to stop using it, how to govern the project when there's high levels of different kinds of uncertainty for different kinds of projects. And so, I have to say the gateway adopter concept came out because, and maybe there's information that I was unaware of that I couldn't find, but when I saw Crossing the Chasm and I was experiencing this situation where I kept talking to the mainstream and said, how do I stop talking to these people? They keep showing up and I want to get rid of them. I couldn't find the core psychographic Q&A that got me the answers. There was these descriptors. I said, no, those aren't operational enough for me. I need to walk in a room, ask a question, hear the response, and get rid of the people who are just going to give me noise. And so many of my tools built heavily on other projects because I said, hey, if there's a solution to this, I'm going to use it. I don't want to reinvent anything. But when my team kept running into the issue with value and having heated arguments that would go on for weeks about what was more value and what was less value, I said, okay, this isn't working. I need to go find a model. I found Kano, tried Kano, wasn't good enough, didn't help my team. How do I reuse that? And so I operationalized something that had lots of insight that has helped Larry and others get his team to be able to make streamline to what's compelling and what's not. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I would never say any of the other things that I've stolen or built on were wrong. They just, in a world full of uncertainty, they didn't take out enough of the uncertainty that I had to figure out what to do to help people go to the next level. And happy to chat someday if you'd like, since we're in the area. Yeah.
Hey, Patrick.
Yes.
I'm Carlos Stillwork, and I got there maybe 3 minutes after you started, but I didn't get a chance to introduce myself, and I apologize for that. But you said something about reevaluating your team.
Yep.
And the importance of that. And I heard a story from a guy who was doing his really first startup, but he hired some great people that had been with prior startups. And one of them is this crazy, super good engineer. Doesn't matter whether it's hardware or software. And they made huge developments. And one day the engineer came into him and said, "I got to quit." And the CEO said, "No, you can't. I need you. You're perfect."
Yeah.
And the guy, he just said, "No, I've been through this before. I'm the guy you need when you're going through the jungle and you need someone to sling a machete. But we've now arrived at the road, and you have a pretty good idea where the town is going to be. And if I keep going with you, I'm actually going to hold you back, because that's the way I am. I'm going to fiddle with new things that you don't want fiddled with.
Right.
And I need to leave." And it's amazing when one of your team members will actually tell you to reevaluate your team. You've sort of been, blind to the issue at hand.
Yeah, one of the things that I've tried to talk about and build on is, and I'm going to actually refer to Tuck, is when I was at grad school, a guy named Shank, which was our strategy guy, got up and he talked about this concept of satisficing. He says this satisficing concept of not refining, not ever improving, just satisficing. He says that perplexed us. We didn't know what to do with it. We see it everywhere. We see when people are successful, but we don't understand it. And I feel like by this big quant research, what I found was where it works really well, because I'm sure that dev person you talked about was awesome about getting through the jungle because he did a lot of satisficing to hack his way out. And then when he got out into the clearing, he's like, all right, that skill's not really valuable anymore. And so I'll go do something else that I'm not really very good at and slow you down. And so they were really awesome about using that heuristic for satisficing. And there are people that do it well. Again, this gateway adopter group, this people who live in the chasm, that was, so I'll go back a second, that's one of the ways I find them. I ask them about that concept. So in this dialogue where I'm pretending to be an analyst and they're giving me answers to how they see the world, instead of saying, "Tell me about your father," I'm asking them other questions. That's one of the things that I talk about, is I talk about their passion or lack of passion for refining, perfection, and things like that. And if they do that, then I know that they're out. I stop talking to them. But if they're the people that know how to satisfy and move on, they might be, answer. Did you have a question that I could answer, or is that just a build on that story?
No question, just an observation.
Yeah, it's really great when the team knows what it's good at and you keep reevaluating, where are we, what's our risk, and do we have a match for the risks that are going to face us next. Anything else?
So we have several startups on the call that are in some level of sprinting to cash flow positive. And at least for me, cash flow positive is the first step on the stairway to scalability, since I'm a bottom-up investor instead of a top-down investor. Do any of you, the startups that are sprinting to cash flow positive, have a barrier or a problem that you think we should talk about?
Yeah, this is Vishnu. I'm with WiseCube, and yeah, I think, I mean, I totally get. I like the idea of gateway adopters, and you mentioned this, but how do you go find like more of these, right? Like as opposed to like the late adopters and the followers and whatnot. Is it just by conducting more interviews and talking to them, or is there like a guidebook that you recommend of?
So let's listen very carefully to what Patrick said, right? He said something very specific. So you're working on a project. Oh, great. Tell me about that project. What kinds of things do you optimize for, right? Patrick, I need you to step in here. So
yes.
What is the risk that is the biggest risk for you in this current stage of your product, right?
Yeah.
So asking about the risk.
Yes.
If there's people that can't tell you about the risk, then they're either early adopters, or they're normal majority people. They're not people that are at the end of the early adopter pile. Because that group of people at the end of the early adopter pile are able to distinguish what their risks are. That's what they're optimizing, is risk. So if you're a techno fiend and you really love the thing you do, and all you want to do is pound with your hammer and do new things, what's the risk of that? Well, they can't tell you. They don't know there's a business risk. They don't know that there's a marketing risk. They can't tell you about their financial risks. Just give me some money so I can build the thing I want to build because everybody's going to love it. Well, everybody loving it is not the likely outcome.
So one of the things I'm going to do is there's my email. And so any of the topics we talked about today, I have presented in a webinar that if you share what you want or which one of the topics you thought was most interesting, I'm happy to share the webinar. I did it for the Association of International Product Managers and Marketers. So the 3 key things about who should you go after, what is compelling to them, and then one of them is what we just talked about today applied to a general product management world, but I'm happy to talk about them.
Can you go back to the tool page, please?
Yeah, I'm good. Oh, the tool, okay.
One more, there it is.
Yeah, let me
not quite up yet. Okay, can you name these 6 tools or 5 tools?
Yes. So the tool down here that is about compelling, viable is not enough. MVPs aren't doing the job. I call that the customer value accelerator, where I take the feature and I walk down this decision tree that represents how human beings really value what you're doing. That's CVA. That's one of the sessions that I can do. Another session is the gateway adopter concept. And this is demographics aren't enough. You need to know the psychographics within a market. I got multiple markets. Which one should I go through first? I call it the innovation tournament, because what you're trying to find is which market should you innovate first on your way to maybe 2 or 3, but which one will pay you money? And then this combination here, I call this the moniker is the Hourglass Interview, because I start really big. What are your biggest issues? What's really getting in the way of your biggest issues? And let's go talk about the tactics you're using to get around them. And then I tend to, at the end, branch out. Now that I've kind of given them that model, if they're a good gateway adopter type, they tend to be really awesome about what else? Is there other things? Is there anything else in this conversation that we may have missed that matters to you? And every once in a while, I find a nugget of gold in this flare back out of this Hourglass Interview. So innovation tournament, customer value accelerator, gateway adopter. The thing we're talked about today, I call top risk now. So there's a paper on my site for that. If you just want to go share it with someone or ask questions and challenge me on it, I'm happy to do that.
And so now that people know the name of these things, they can send you an email and say, I'd really like to see a video about the Hourglass Interview or whatever, and you can share that. And if there's enough people that want to dive into detail, we can either talk about it at the open copies that we do every Tuesday, or we can set up another workshop to go in deeper on any of these. And you have a bucket of another 75 tools that you can talk about. So there's even more depth if people want.
If I think of myself as a physician and I keep seeing patients, innovators coming in with the same maladies, these address the common issues of, are you eating right? Are you sleeping right? Are you getting exercise? They almost always can benefit from getting these right. Who are you going after? What's compelling to them? And how are you managing and governing your time and investment? Those are almost always cases where I have a big impact. And once we get through that, then we start working on the other 30-something tools.
Go ahead, Shaiwal.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would be interested in the first 3 that you mentioned, the gateway adopters, the CVA, and the market, I guess.
So send me a clip, and happy to send you both the papers and the webinars I did. And if that is not enough, I'm happy to engage. That's how you can look at it in your own time. And, or if you want John to set up another time, happy to do that. And dig into the next level of, okay, how do you really use this? In the end, my passion is for helping teams be creative. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give them a language to understand what people value, what customers will value. And that's what all of these are, is I unblock a situation where I keep seeing teams fight, argue, and have problems where I say, okay, you don't have the language. And so many times these existed because both people that were there were right. They were just right about something different. And they didn't have a way to say, oh, we really need this must, or your product's broken. That's what the must level is down here at the bottom. But the other person was saying, yeah, but once we have it, no one cares. And they're both right. And so how do you have a dialogue to make sure that your team aligns work to what value it really creates? That's what this CVA thing was about. I'm sorry I didn't put the labels on there. To get to...
Hey, Patrick, I got another question. So you had a slide in there that where startups, can deal with the top risk now, and then they keep, finding the next risk, and then it's kind of like almost a timeline slide.
Yeah,
right? This one.
Yeah.
So I have a question, maybe to you and also the investors in the group. Like, I typically, startups put up this sort of timeline slide, how we got here sort of slide in the pitch deck. And normally I don't talk about the pivots we took and all the mistakes we made and the kinds of things we did to address the risks that we found along the way. The question is, would that actually help or hurt, when we're actually pitching to investors, to show that we've learned and we've grown, and here's all the risks we've addressed over time, and here's how we pivoted or not, more from a founder sort of pitching, perspective. So
John's best qualified. I'm going to be an amateur and say one of the reasons I've had people work with me is because that they know that because I can learn, that if they tell me something I didn't know before or I didn't want to hear, that they know that I have the emotional EQ to learn from it and go forward. And that's an important aspect of building a relationship with a potential funder.
Yeah. Because I'm realizing, like, we did go, like, at least from my personal journey, we did go through a similar journey where we like, oh, what is the value? And we pivoted, and like, oh, there's a problem with the team, and we've added people. And there was this process, even though it was not a conscious one, and it was not following your framework. But I'm wondering if there's value talking about that to a potential investor, and actually in a slide like this, right? So
in the beginning, you're setting impression of you about what you're trying to do, right? So in the beginning, I wouldn't lead with your zits. I would lead with your capacity and capability and compellingness. But in the end, the investors should know that regardless of how good you are, your business is full of risks. And the question is, how well can the team deal with risks? The probability that all of the team members are right better than 99% of the time is near zero. And so you have to be able to adapt and grow. And the investors as a whole are interested in the question of your ability of the team to deal with the risk and deal with the uncertainty and then get beyond that, right? So we'll use a very pedantic definition of a business. Business is the point at which the cost, you have bounded the cost of customer acquisition, and you have some level of growth in your customer base, right? At that point, you're a business. Before then, you're a startup. And so our goal really as investors is to invest in a business. But we want to invest in a business probably before it's a business, because by the time it's a business, then the value proposition goes down for us a little bit. And so angel investors are investing earlier, and you have everything buttoned down, and now everything just works, right? That's Series A, maybe Series B kind of thinking, right? And we're earlier than that. So to sort of make us more comfortable, we would like to see you evolve. So like in the Angel Conference, you're going to spend 3 months here with people. If you're telling us the same thing today as you're telling us in November, you have not evolved and you are not a fast growing company, right? So we would expect there to be shifts and pivots and changes and adjustments and reasoning for why that change happened.
So can I just throw something in here as a concept that might be helpful? The thing that we found when we introduced Crossing the Chasm is there seems to be this assumption that there's always a chasm, and that's absolutely untrue. The innovation adoption curve really works on categories, not on products. So if you're just building something that's a better mousetrap, if you're just improving on what people already know, there are no innovators and early adopters. And the example I use that will blow your mind is the iPhone. There were no early adopters of the iPhone. It's because the category is called mobile electronics. And there were already people with PDAs. There were people with digital cameras. There were people with, handheld computers. Those are the innovators and early adopters on mobile electronics. So when the iPhone came out, it went straight into the mainstream. So you have to start, number one, you ask the question, are you introducing a continuous innovation or a discontinuous innovation? And yeah, exactly. So there was the iPod was before the iPhone too. People were used to carrying mobile devices, and all founders, and I was looking up WiseCube and what is that? That's AI for, drug delivery. The question becomes, all right, is this something that's a refinement and everybody already knows? In which case there is no chasm, there are no early adopters, there are no innovators. Or is it something that no one has ever seen before? And if it's something that no one's ever seen before, you go out and start talking to them about that, and they'll go, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. So that's always step number one. Are you continuous or discontinuous? Because that determines whether there's the front part of the curve or not.
And it's very interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. More as well. Yeah.
So one of the things that's important for us to understand is a bunch of these examples that people use are corporate examples, like the iPod and the iPhone, where they already had millions and millions of customers. And so their ability to select, develop, and drive a market is a fundamentally different thing than two guys in a garage with a crazy idea and a customer list of 3. It just doesn't go the same way. Right?
Yeah, but it also we can apply it to the electric car. Look at an electric car. All right, look at all the behavior change and new learning that imposes on an end user. Now everyone knows what cars are. That's a given. And we've got lots and lots of big companies. However, if you look at is it truly discontinuous? Absolutely, because you've got to learn how far you can drive it, how to plug it in, where to plug it in. There are all kinds of elements around making that what's called discontinuous. And that's why the adoption rate of electric cars worldwide is what, 1-2% of the installed base? It's not even close to the mainstream. And yet it is a well-known device. It's called, you drive it as for transportation. So, the question to really ask is, how much learning and behavior change are you imposing on the end user? If it doesn't take much to learn it, if people already kind of know it, then you're already into the mainstream. So don't waste your time going out looking for early adopters of something when you're just introducing a better mousetrap as a continuous innovation. And this is 30 years of misunderstanding that I wish I could have corrected. And all the way back to, I don't know if you can see that this is the original manuscript of Crossing the Chasm, and all the things that, all of my notes about what I wish Jeff Moore had changed, and he didn't, unfortunately, and it's led to these misunderstandings. You have got to ask whether or not you're continuous or discontinuous, and the way to find that out, how much do you impose behavior change and new learning on the end user, and then you know where you fall on the curve, because it's really a category curve.
So remember that we have a bunch of people who are functionally novices at running a business. And they need to find an audience that are willing to practice with them. And so that sense of finding people who seek the novel is important, even if the category already exists, just as fodder to build a team that's capable of executing in the space. And so there's more than just the product curve adoption in that goal of seeking the people at the early end of the curve. And it may be that the early adopters of the category have already moved on to some other place where they're willing to be in a different category already. And you still need to find the neophytes, that's not the right word, neophiles, who want to find the new thing to play with, even if the category is proven and going, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that, because if a category is in the mainstream, the characteristics of the mainstream is they want incremental improvements, not large, quantum leap improvements. So
right.
you're
so
still
how do I build
still
a team that's capable of doing that in a way that allows me not to fall flat on my face in front of the majority?
Fall flat on your face. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
If I have a team that's a new team that doesn't know how to play in the market, how do I play in the market enough to build the skills of the team before I show it to the early majority who have this notion of some level of performance and perfection on features that causes them to reject and then brand that thing that is being explored as insufficient.
Yeah, I still think that there's fundamental confusion here about if a category of a product is in the mainstream, that means there's going to be all sorts of things that are supporting it. There are going to be people who know about that category. There are going to be ecosystems. There are going to be channels of distribution. There are going to be all sorts of things, complementary tools and services. So it's not like building a team to build something that no one's ever seen before. You're building a team that wants to create a refinement over something everybody's seen before. And it's a completely different setting, completely. And you can talk to all kinds of people about what the team skills need to be, what the value propositions need to be in the mainstream. That's easy because it's there. It's when you're creating something no one has seen before, which is a truly discontinuous innovation. That's where it becomes a problem. You have no points of reference to make smart decisions from.
Right.
I
I agree with you on the core principle you're saying. I'm just saying there's some greater risks than the adoption of the customers at some point, at which point you have to focus on those other risks, like in the case I'm trying to examine, the team risk of being the right team to do the job for the market. But in any case, I want to sort of leave space for other questions. So we have only 8 minutes left.
Okay.
So Larry, you had a question?
Yeah, could I pick up on what you were all talking here? I mean, I know you just said, can we move to another subject? But we're right in that space right now, in that earliest, the innovators, the early adopters. We're right in that right now in a very small business target audience of about 300 companies around the U.S. So our early adopter it's a small number, and what we're really looking forward to is getting to that early majority. And then speaking to the crossing the chasm, there is that peer-to-peer reference, that ability to look across and see that somebody else is using the same product. I use the example of, well, if you had something that works for a fish store and a shoe store, well, the fish store people think, okay, well, that's okay. The shoe store's using that, but they're not a fish store, so they don't know my thing. But when you look for a real peer-to-peer, oh, yeah, that fish store is, another fish store is doing that thing. It must be okay. And the more fish stores you get doing the thing, the better. So that's what we're trying to do as we get our first early adopters and the innovators, and establish one or more of them as what looks like a working fish store. So
what was the other store you're referencing this?
Shoe store, fish store, whatever.
Shoe store. Okay, yeah. So the thing that I found, and again, I have the presentation for what are the statistically significant differences between the people that are at this leading edge of the early majority and this late part of the early adopters, the people I think are in the chasm. And the thing that they did is they wanted to do something that other people don't do to get a competitive advantage. So if the mainstream was already doing it, they don't care. They're like, I don't want to talk about that. The only reason I like to hear about it is so that I know what I got to do better then. They literally would say things like that. And they're looking, there will be fish store owners who are saying, hey, tell me about that thing that worked at the shoe store, because I'd love to disrupt the fish store world in my category by using something that worked in this other place. And that's because they're motivated to win. So they have this weird psychographic, not weird, they have this psychographic that's kind of known that says, I want to be the disruption that other people have to follow. So that's what they're motivated by. Their amygdala is wired different. And then they're seeking stuff that will give them that. And then they've built up this skill set that allows them to chunk things up in small pieces. So I think you could find fish store buyers who are looking for tricks of the trade in other retail establishments to use in the fish store world.
So he's got a relatively small market, 300 stores.
Yep.
What recipe could you give him that would let him prioritize the order in which he deploys his software in those 300 stores?
The order in which he, well, you say deploys, so you think I'm going to go engage with them and see if they're interested, right?
Well, he's gonna take over the market. That's his goal, right? Own 80% of that market.
Yeah.
He wants to deploy them, go from 0 to 1, and then from 1 to 10, and 10 to 100, and be the market leader essentially. So how does he pick number 1, and how does he pick number 10 as the places where he should be putting his marketing and sales resources to accomplish the task?
So again, I'm going to come from the experience that I have, and I'm going to say, I'm going to ask that. By the way, so when I go recruit them, like I think Vishnu talked about this too. When I want to go find them, I use marketing and messaging and positioning to engage them and put messages out there that other people don't like in the same demographic. I do.
Yep.
I actually, one of my filters is, do you want to know what's a proven solution in your world, or do you want something that's going to help, do something different than everyone else? And almost immediately I get the bifurcation that I'm looking for. Previous to that, I've put out a message that is about, how do I help you gain a competitive advantage? Would you like to do something that nobody else does? Blah, blah, blah. I will use that in I think they call it a power offer model. Like there's a standard template to get people who live in this part of the curve to say, oh, I want to do that. Now, when I get them there, it usually takes about 2 questions. Then I ask them about their ability to deal with uncertainty. Like, tell me about the last time you did a project where you did something you've never done before. And if they don't have an example, they're out. And then if they said, oh yeah, here's one that I did and I didn't know about this, and I said, well, how'd you deal with it? And I listened for their understanding of risk mitigation and how they picked a tool to do it. So we get 2 minutes to go. So let me do a quick, this is a short version of the webinar. Is the front of the curve doesn't know their risks and the back of the curve doesn't know their risks. They have no idea. They're just like, they're oblivious to them. They were statistically insignificant difference between them. So about a third of the world doesn't have any idea what their risks are. The middle, this end kind of started to know, and about the time you hit the middle, they actually could start telling you what their risks are. And so you are quickly able to get down to this front early majority group by saying, do you know what your risks are? Boom, most of the curve is gone. It turns out that most of this early adopter group, even though they're fully aware of their risks, have no toolkit to deal with it. They go, I know what they are. And then I say, well, what do you do? And then they tell me the same story the guys on the back of the curve say, which is, I look for somebody who's already solved that and I do what they did. Same story. So it's this change in mindset that they know their risks, and then they built a toolbox of methodologies to deal with the different kinds of uncertainty. And so what I did to find a single question, if I'm in a quant research mode, I can ask, do you invest in building your toolbox, depending upon who I'm talking, the domain, that toolbox is a bracketed thing that I fill in depending upon the domain. But I said, if you're investing in continually refreshing the tools you use to deal with uncertainty, it's a 85% high confidence predictor that I'm dealing with this person who actually leads the mainstream because they're solving a problem the mainstream has and they're trying to do it in a way no one else does, because they have built out this tool set that they do that allows them to take uncertainty that no one else would even consider. And that's the single question that gives me what I need to know.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I really appreciate you doing this workshop for us. Can you switch to your end slide so people can find your address again? If you have a question that you'd like Patrick to address, please drop him a note and tell him about it. And we're glad to put more workshops together around these kinds of questions. Our next workshop is about cash flow and financial modeling, which is where I'm expecting all of the startups to be putting their assumptions and their evidence of knowledge of their assumptions. And Carly's really good at doing that. So we'll do that next Tuesday. We have some great speakers lined up, including Dave Parker on the 14th of August, talking about revenue models. So please do go and look at the Seattle Angel Meetup group and join the workshops that you think are good. I hope to see you next week at our workshops. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.
Great workshop. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Patrick.